Russia's going to be helping. Russia wants to see Ukraine succeed. Once, it sounds a little strange, but I was explaining to the president, President Putin was very generous in his feeling toward Ukraine succeeding, including supplying energy, electricity, and other things at very low prices. So a lot of good things came out of that call today.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has rejected a proposed ceasefire in Ukraine. President Trump said that Putin would like Ukraine to succeed. Meanwhile, Russia and Ukraine are very close to a peace deal. How close are we to deal on ending the war in Ukraine, and how Trump and Zelensky achieved a breakthrough? U.S. President Donald Trump said on Sunday that Vladimir Putin had rejected a proposed ceasefire not tied to a broader political settlement. Trump made the remarks after more than 2 hours of talks with Zelensky at his Florida residence, saying Russia and Ukraine were very close to a peace deal, but that one or two very difficult issues, particularly over territory, remain unresolved. Trump said he had spoken with Putin earlier in the day in what he described a good and very productive call. Trump suggested Putin would like Ukraine to succeed and could even help rebuild Ukraine and supply cheap energy after the war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky appeared skeptical hearing that, reflecting concerns in Kyiv that optimism toward Moscow risked ignoring accountability. According to Trump, Putin rejected the idea of a pause in fighting, preferring negotiations focused on a final settlement rather than interim truce. Zelensky, speaking after talks, said Ukraine had made significant progress with U.S. on proposed peace framework. However, Zelensky stressed that any final deal need to comply with Ukrainian law and reflect public opinion. He said sensitive issues like territory might require approval by Ukrainian parliament or the public. In comment reported by Axios, Zelensky said he hoped to agree with Trump on framework to end the war and said he would be willing to bring key elements of such agreement to a national referendum if Russia agrees to a 60-day ceasefire. Zelensky told Axios that Ukraine saw a longer ceasefire as essential to test Russia's intentions and seek approval from the people. Following their meeting, Trump and Zelensky held a video call with European leaders to brief them on the state of negotiations. Trump said it could take several weeks to determine whether the remaining disagreements could be resolved and cautioned that a final deal was not assured. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine had reached security agreement with U.S. on security guarantees, a critical demand for Ukraine as it seeks protection from against future Russian aggression as part of a deal, according to Reuters. Axios also reports that U.S. had proposed a 15-year security guarantee arrangement, renewable at the end of the term, but that Kyiv had pushed for a longer deal with legally binding provisions to better deter future Russian aggression. Trump did not publicly comment on the length or legal nature of that, but said European allies would be involved in any long-term security arrangement. He emphasized that any final accord would need to comply with the Ukrainian constitution and reflect domestic political consent, pointing to potential parliamentary or referendum hurdles. The talks focused on officials described as 20-point peace framework that is nearing completion, though neither side disclosed details on borders, enforcement mechanism, or Russia's former role. These unresolved issues are being closely watched by investors and policy makers who see territorial concessions and security guarantees as central of regional stability. From a geopolitical perspective, the meeting reinforces Trump's effort to reposition Washington as a primary broker of peace, with European allies expected to be drawn more deeply into the process in the upcoming weeks. Trump said additional negotiations involving Europeans would be needed to finalize the deal. Despite diplomatic momentum, the security situation on the ground remains fragile. Associated Press CNN reported ongoing Russian missile and drone attacks across Ukraine during the same period, highlighting the discontent and disconnect between battlefield dynamics and diplomatic process, a risk factor markets continue to price into Eastern European assets and global energy supply forecasts, Russia's stance remain uncertain. Reuters reported separately that Moscow opposes temporary ceasefire, not embed into a wider deal, signaling that Vladimir Putin's acceptance of any deal may depend on how territorial and security provisions are resolved. While no agreement was reached, both leaders framed the talks as a step toward a negotiated end of the war. Trump said the coming weeks would be decisive in determining whether remaining obstacles can be overcome, while Zelensky reiterated Ukraine's insistence on a durable settlement backed by firm guarantees, Reuters reported. Also, major US and international media outlets cautioned that unresolved issues remain and could derail any final deal. While statements from both leaders struck an optimism tone, US and global media outlets framed the moment as one of progress rather than resolution. Reuters and Associated Press emphasized that the talks appear focused on finalizing a framework rather than a binding deal, noting that details on borders, enforcement mechanism and Russia's commitments remain unspecified. Analysts quoted by Reuters highlighted that such issues have historically proven decisive in previous peace efforts. Bloomberg focused on geopolitical implications, noting that Trump's public optimism fits a broader effort to reassert US leadership in diplomacy while pushing European allies to share responsibility for long-term security. Bloomberg analysts also cautioned that peace framework often arrive late in negotiations, particularly when territorial concessions and enforcement provisions remain unresolved. Another recurring theme across coverage from Reuters, CNN, and other outlets is skepticism over Russia's willingness to fully embrace and enforce a deal. Reuters separately reported that Moscow remains opposed to temporary ceasefires, not embedded within a broader political deal, underscoring uncertainty about whether the Kremlin will accept terms emerging from the US-Ukraine negotiations. At the same time, Associated Press noted that Russian missile and drone strikes continue during the diplomatic push, highlighting the disconnect between battlefield realities and negotiation tactics. Several outlets describe this contrast as key risk. Diplomacy may be advancing faster than conditions on the ground are stabilizing. US media coverage also highlighted the domestic constraints facing both presidents. Zelensky repeated references to Ukrainian law and public approval were widely interpreted, including by Reuters, as an acknowledgement that concessions on territory could face strong resistance from Ukrainians. Analysts noted that even US-backed agreement would need broad domestic legitimacy to endure. Trump, meanwhile, was portrayed by Bloomberg and CNN as seeking a diplomatic breakthrough that reinforces his image as a deal-maker while avoiding open-ended US commitments. His emphasis on involving Europeans was seen as a both strategic necessity and a political calculation. That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and glory to Ukraine.